This evening, then, we will be continuing our evaluation of the topic of gender, particularly from a Catholic anthropological perspective. And to guide us, we are using Jason Everett's book, Male, Female, Other. Two other notable books that I highly recommend, as always, is When Harry Became Sally by Ryan Anderson, and also Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier. All right, so this evening, the claim that Everett will be speaking to, the idea of a rigid gender binary is the result of Western colonialism. Okay, sure. All right, so we'll put that in paragraph form here. Before Europeans imposed their values on indigenous people, cultures around the world celebrated third gender individuals and even revered diverse gender identities and expressions. The Native American two-spirit people, the American Haijara and Hajin, the Fa'afafine of Samoa, and the Kathoe of Indonesia, I'm slaughtering these, are just a few examples that dispel the myth that only two genders exist. All right. First of all, how people express themselves in different cultures has nothing to do with whether or not something's right or wrong. If we find something in a culture, it doesn't mean it's right or wrong. In one of his There Are Only Two Genders videos, Steven Crowder was talking with somebody, and he was making this. Well, you have to understand, I just read a paragraph of what the claim is, and then Everett's going to spend the rest of the chapter talking about it, right? So the people are saying that there are only two genders that exist as a myth to be dispelled. Right? Well, first of all, however a man or a woman, what roles, what clothing, stuff like that they may wear in a different culture, has nothing to do with sexual binary. We are a sexually dimorphic species. That's just how it is. So, end of discussion. However, like I said before, often, for whatever reason, when people use the word gender, what they're usually using this word to talk about roles. First of all, unnecessary to use that word in relation to roles. It's, yes, the Scottish word kilts, absolutely. Wear kilts, everybody. Who was it? Groundskeeper Willie. And there was a few times where he was wearing a kilt, and he wasn't wearing anything under that kilt. It's so funny. That's hilarious. Such a great character. Absolutely. And so often when some people, now once again, I have no use for the word gender. Absolutely no use for the word beyond grammar and language, and maybe using it colloquially as a term that's interchangeable or synonymous with sex. We see this on legal documents, for instance, that they're used interchangeably. Outside of that, I see no utility for the word whatsoever. And I think what's problematic is they've taken the word, they've completely divorced it from being interchangeable with the word sex, and has given the word a life of its own. And so the term is associated with how a male expresses himself in a culture, how a male dresses in a culture, a role that a male may have in a culture. First of all, we don't even need to use the word gender. Just there's a dude, and he lives in culture XYZ, and he does this. These are the roles that this dude does. These are the types of clothing that dude wears. I see no use for the word gender in relation to any of that. In addition, people use the term to describe some inner sense of identity, which once again, why not you just say inner sense of identity? You don't even need the word gender. Just get rid of the word altogether. Just talk about identity, how you see yourself, why you think you have value, who are you, stuff like that. And even then, it's greatly rooted in a context that you can't control, such as I am my father's son, I am my mother's son, I am my brother's brother, I am my wife's husband, and so on and so forth. All right. I am in relation to other people. I am in relation to nature. So, what am I? Well, I'm a man. All right, of this sexually dimorphic species, Homo sapien, in which we find ourselves. I am a man. I am the seed bearer. I couple with a woman. I, pass on genetic material, and life goes on. That's the way nature is geared. All right, so we don't need the word gender to talk about inner sense of identity. In fact, I haven't really had much use of using the term identity so much either. Me personally, no. The closest I can get to maybe using the word basically comes down to that, okay, I am made in the image and likeness of God. All right, so I'm starting to define what a human is. How do we see human nature? It's created in the image and likeness of God. Male and female, he created them. So that's has to do with the way in which we will relate with one another in various ways. What is this? A vegetarian is an ancient tribal slang for village idiot who can't hunt, fish, or ride. That's clever. Is it true that we really need to have a strong anthropology? Like, how do we understand human nature? This is actually vitally important. And a false understanding of human nature can lead people to justify abortion, for example. Sometimes people get hung up on, is it a person or not? A person has to do with memory and thoughts and consciousness and this, that. And I'm like, take it one step back. All right, we don't need to use the word person, just human nature. Why are you destroying human nature? Right? Innocent human nature. Right? What is human nature? All right, made in the image and likeness of God. Oh, okay, so in a sense, we are those for whom Christ died. Very well, we can talk about that. It begins to think in terms of who we are in Christ. A Christian. What is a Christian? We can start talking about what constitutes a Christian, and I can talk about all of those things without ever having to use the word identity or inner sense of self or anything like that. In fact, I think people are overly focused on the subjective sense of self. I think it leads to self-centeredness, egotism. I think obsessing about it can lead to mental illness, because we were meant to gift ourselves to others, to give ourselves to others in service to one another, to will the good of others, and so on and so forth. And often people internalize so much. They're overly focused and overwhelmed by their emotions, and it's just not good. With that said, often other things that people do, they'll take the word gender and they'll shove all kinds of different meanings and things into it. Once again, you don't have to do that. Like personality. Just talk about personality. Just get rid of the word gender. Temperament. People try to shove that in there. Nope. Just talk about temperaments. Okay, whether you're sanguine or melancholic or so on and so forth, just talk about temperament. Gender, just throw the word out. You don't need the word. I think that is probably the healthiest thing for our culture to do right now, is to quit using this very ambiguous, undefined term that people try to shove all kinds of stuff into it. We don't need any of that. Right? It's very confusing. It really ends up being a distraction. And once again, overly focusing on the subjective aspect of self can often lead one to a place of experiencing a kind of discordance with reality, because they're overly focused on perception and sense and everything else, the experience of the moment, and often all of that gets divorced from reality. And so once again, going back to the Crowder thing, he says there are only two genders. Changed my mind. And one person was sitting down and they were saying, "Oh, they do this in this culture," and he's like, "So they have slavery in other cultures. Why should it matter to me what these other cultures are doing? It doesn't matter if you can point it out." Yet people do very similar things when they look at something in nature, like the goby fish and how it can change sex. Or you remember the whole basis for the Jurassic Park film? How they filled in gaps in the DNA with frog DNA, and it happened to have been like some kind of frog that can change male and female in single sex environments, and that's how the dinosaurs were able to begin reproducing and all of that jazz. Yeah, is pointing out something in nature. Okay, that's great for the goby fish. That's great for some southeastern African frog or something. It all comes down to what is human nature, and how do we understand that? So looking to other cultures to try to justify something is irrelevant. Somebody could use the exact same argument with slavery, or all kinds of different practices and things that a different culture may make. It makes no difference whatsoever. It's supposed to be a common joke in the Tibetan culture. I've heard people say that. It's kind of a weird common joke, I guess. I saw the video. I saw people talk about the Dalai Lama and his suck my tongue thing, and even if that is done in some other culture, you really have to think about boundaries. I get certain things can be highly sexualized in certain cultures, and certain other things aren't. Like, you would think that touching somebody's butt, for example, is like always sexual. But you see people do this in sports all the time. They're always touching each other's butts for some reason while they're giving a pat. It's like, don't touch me. We teach our kids about bathing suit areas. We don't touch these spots on other kids, and we don't let other kids touch us in those bathing suit area things, And so there is context. There is we've talked about it before. Different cultures are different, but that seems really creepy to me. And again, I don't eat cats and stuff and things like this, so I don't appreciate everything that might be found in some other culture. There could be a culture out there where it's okay for 8-year-olds to be married off. to men. Just because we can find it in a culture somewhere doesn't mean that it's necessarily appropriate. It just means that it became more something that really in our culture, which would be disturbing and taboo, had become uh, socially acceptable, at least to some. Um, but I'm still looking at, the rest of the world looking at that. What would that mean to the rest of the world? It's like, I don't know. And again, maybe a handshake is actually a threat to another culture. You stick your hand out for a handshake and he thinks you're declaring war, even though you're just doing a gesture of hello, for instance, or something like that. I mean, I get that stuff. But like putting your mouth on, I don't know. It's like, you remember the opening scene of Ace Ventura where he's climbing the mountain and he gets to this bird nest uh, and shaking the least, or in the case of Joe Biden, a fist bump. There we go. That always goes well. Ace Ventura is climbing the mountain. He gets to this bird nest, and he starts like acting like he's regurgitating into their mouths. He's like, "That ought to hold you." I think of weird stuff, but yeah, I mean, you see different things in nature, you see different things in other cultures, but I mean, that doesn't mean that there isn't some sort of objective standard or appropriateness that ultimately can look at an element of a culture and say the culture kind of went astray on that. We could see that in our own culture with abortion and euthanasia and what country is that eradicated all Down syndrome because they effectively eradicated Down syndrome because they killed all the Down syndrome kids in the womb, and so there aren't any being born. No, it's not India. I'm thinking of it. I think it was like Norway or Sweden or one of the Scandinavian countries or something. Very, very liberal, I hear, though those countries are. They're very, very socially inclusive and stuff. I think a lot of people who live here that want to try to force certain things in our culture should go and live in the Scandinavian countries. Let's just go there. I was talking to a guy who lives in Sweden. He said he pays like 70% of his income to taxes because basically it's one big social program. Yeah, that's a lot of taxes. And he's a father of like 5 kids or something. 70% of your income. I guess maybe they don't have to go shopping or something. I don't know. It's crazy. There's no question that cultures around the world and throughout history display a broad range of gender expressions and social roles for men and women. Such societies also use a wide range of titles to describe individuals who don't fit into stereotypically masculine or feminine categories. However, these historical facts do not prove that a third gender exists. Such an argument falls short on 3 accounts. It is guilty of primordialism, it is historically inaccurate and oversimplified, and it is anachronistic. When university professors of gender theory attempt to promote the idea of third gender individuals living in a idyllic past, they want students to believe that before white Europeans descended upon civilizations untouched by Western dogmas, indigenous people across the globe were blissfully unaware of the modern colonialist idea that men aren't women. Instead, they enjoyed liberation and were free to be their authentic selves. In their article, Romancing the Transgender Native, Evan Towle and Lynn Morgan, who identify as transgender themselves, present a blistering critique of this narrative. They argue that it falsely places other cultures in an idealized primordial location, a Garden Eden where gender diversity flourished before the fall into Western modernity, in an age before oppressive gender ideologies were invented. End quote. So these are two individuals who identify as transgender who are saying this. As I keep saying, there are many ideologies. There isn't what one would refer to as a transgender ideology. There's ideologies, and they're all in conflict with one another. And there isn't a single monolithic perspective, but rather it's just a hodgepodge, a conglomeration of loosely fitting, even contradictory ideas that are simply tolerated. They continue, quote, such accounts of historical and non-Western gender variability are used to suggest that our contemporary transgender variability is both ancient and natural. Third gender societies are accorded a primordial foundational location in our thinking, as though they underlay and predate Western gender formulations. Once again, nature has its own role in teaching us that we're sexually dimorphic. Beyond that, I don't give a crap what people use the word gender for. It's absolutely irrelevant to me. Unless you're using it synonymously and interchangeably with the word sex, like on a lot of legal documents in the United States, it has zero utility for me. And so just because there are people who might dress differently or think of themselves differently, it doesn't make a third sex, as if there's some sort of third gamete or something like that. None of that makes any difference. According to this narrative, the transgender native becomes an icon of indigenous innocence, repressed by patriarchal structures. But in the words of Towle and Morgan, the transgender native is actually, quote, a literary trope often used in transgender testimonial writing. It serves in several texts as a generic, seductive figure who lives an idealized existence in a utopian place and time, end quote. In the words of one trans activist, quote, in some cultures, including Native American cultures, transgendered people were not only accepted but revered, end quote. A sober look at the historical evidence reveals that while individuals who lived outside of the typical framework of masculinity and femininity were sometimes revered, they often faced overwhelming ridicule, harassment, and violent persecution within their own societies long before being influenced by European social norms. Minimizing their struggles might help promote the myth of an ideal past, but it's not historically honest. Most people have never heard of the Hijari, Sasadhin, or Fa'afafine. As a result, when such names are used in gender theory classes to promote the idea of a third gender, most students have no option but to listen and learn. A closer examination of these titles reveals that they don't fit nearly into the Western concept of gender. One reason for this, according to Towle and Morgan, is that quote, the third gender concept lumps all non-normative gender variations into one category, limiting our understandings of the range and diversity of gender ideologies and practices, end quote. Perhaps the most glaring example of this is the fact that segregating sexuality from gender, as I was talking about before, is a distinctively Western concept. This can be seen in popular catchphrases such as sexuality is who you go to bed with, but gender is who you are to is who you go to bed as. In many cultures, that's just a weird comment. When people see, sex is just a short term for sexual reproduction. So unless you're engaging in sexual reproduction, you may be engaging in an act that involves a genital, but it's not sex per se. I don't hear anybody else saying this. Like contracepted sex, even between a man and woman, is not even sex. It's mutual masturbation. I, there's nothing sexual reproductive about it. I think it's because people have used the word sex in more loose senses, such as you're using a sexual organ or something. But the whole reason why that we use as a categorical, humans are sexual as opposed to asexual, for example. So what are we using the term for? We're talking about how we reproduce. So if it's not an act of reproduction, then it's something else. I don't know. Maybe it's just the way I think. Sometimes there might be connotations to words that become commonly used, but then I kind of question that. Why is it commonly used? And I try to pull back and think, well, I don't think I'm going to use that language. It's like using the term homosexual. There's technically no such thing. If by it you say that a man is attracted to a man, well, okay, there's same-sex attraction. Why does it have anything to do with genitals and all of that stuff? And even if they do, it's not sexual reproduction. I don't know. It's just weird. I've kind of reserved the word for a very specific definition in the true and proper sense, and I just kind of avoid connotations and the way that people in our culture might use it, because I think by pulling that back, I can make distinctions. We're not talking about sexuality when you are directing your urges outside of sexual reproduction, for example. And I think part of this comes from the fact of me being immersed in Catholic sexual ethics, because the language that I'm using makes perfect sense in terms of speaking against all forms of contraception and bodily mutilations that inhibit sexual reproduction when husband and wife engage in the conjugal act. So it's very specific language. I like to use very specific language because I'm trying to draw distinctions. Like when I get rid of the word gender altogether and just talk about personality and talk about temperament and stuff like that. I don't... And I think I have more of a tendency to do that if I see something in our culture. If I see immorality and I see really depraved ideas, it makes me want to kind of deconstruct the concept that seems to be so common, and the influence and that people use to justify for certain behaviors and something, and just adjust the language and draw some distinctions to obviously this is a Catholic stream, so I'm speaking in terms of Catholic morality. And so ultimately in the Catholic Church, you have God, who is the absolute point of reference for all morality, who is the good, the true, and the beautiful, who's all holy and all loving and everything else, who is righteous, justice, and then you have him becoming incarnate through Christ and all the things he taught. God revealed himself through Moses in the Old Testament. And so there are some unchanging morality there as well. And then you have Christ established the Catholic Church, which is the pillar and foundation of the truth. And the keys of the kingdom were given to Peter. So they have a binding and loosing, a rabbinical binding and loosing authority in order to teach concerning faith and morals. And so when it comes to Catholic ethics, he never thought of the church itself being moral. As being one who actually teaches morality. Having the attribute of being holy, that too. There are 4 marks of the church: 1, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Holy has to do with being set apart for God's exclusive use. And so it's going to be unlike the culture, is going to be unlike the world. Sometimes we see the world kind of seeping in. Sometimes you get, a bad pope here, a bad priest there, a bad bishop there. But the teaching of the church, 1/3 of the catechism of the Catholic Church is dedicated to morality and going over the 10 Commandments and so on and so forth. So the Catholic Church, if you really look at it, one of the high points in Christology is the atonement. What did Christ become incarnate to do? According to Aquinas, had salvific significance. And so it has to do with saving us from our sins, saving us from depravity. And so it's one of the 3 roles of the church. There's a teaching authority, there's the governing the faithful, administration. So there's the proclamation of the gospel, administration of the churches, but there's also the sacraments, the sanctification. And so one of the 3 roles of the church is dedicated to the pursuit of holiness and our consciences being properly formed by Catholic moral teaching. That's why 1/3 of the catechism is dedicated to morality and so on and so forth. So it's one of the pillars of Christianity altogether. So it is certainly vitally important. See, where are we at? Perhaps the most glaring catchphrases. Okay, in many cultures, the two are intertwined. Your masculinity or femininity are revealed by how you express your sexuality. Take, for example, the Hajaris, also known as Kiner or Kinner. I slaughter stuff because I have no idea what it sounds like. So I'm just reading here. If you want it, you can get the book yourself. Within parts of Indian culture, these are sexually impotent males who have their genitals removed in a ritual while facing an image of a goddess to achieve ritual powers. Are we going to recommend this in our culture? Maybe wear a goat head and do some human sacrifices while we're at it. They often wear women's clothing, assume their mannerisms, take on feminine names, have male sexual partners, and are often used as prostitutes. However, according to anthropologist Adnan Hazain's research of Hajaris in Bangladesh, their identity is rooted more in their sexuality than in their religious roles. They are not understood to be women. Rather, they are castrated males, considered within Hinduism to have achieved a calling for their goddess. If they refuse to assume this role, their punishment is that they will be reborn impotent 7 times. Wow. 7 reborn. Incarnation into bodies that are impotent. That's quite interesting. Another gender variant within Indian culture is the sadhin. These are young women who refuse to marry and sometimes take on uh, certain traditionally male roles. Within traditional Hindu culture, the only accepted roles for a female are those of wife and mother. Since the sadhin do not embrace these roles, they form their own social niche. However, they are not considered to have changed their sexual identity. Rather than labeling such a person a third gender, a more accurate understanding could be gained by understanding the social pressures that might influence a young Hindu woman to choose celibacy. A Hindu moral legal text, Manu Smriti, which has often been quoted in Supreme Court judgments in India, contains regulations regarding a woman's role within marriage. It states, quote, though destitute of virtue, or seeking pleasure elsewhere, or devoid of good qualities, yet a husband must be constantly worshipped as a god by a faithful wife. End quote. Interesting. If a woman opts out of marriage because she finds this lifelong misogynistic arrangement to be less than ideal, she does not cease to be a woman. To use her experience to prove gender theory is reductive and unconvincing. Samoan culture provides another example where a foreign concept of gender doesn't fit into Western framework. The word fa'afafani means like a woman, or in the manner of a woman. These are effeminate males who often take on the social roles of women and dressed accordingly. However, they don't typically experience distress over their bodies or seek surgical changes. Paul Vassie, a Canadian psychology professor, explains, quote, if Fa'afafine went to New Zealand or Australia and had a sex change operation and returned to Samoa, no one in Samoa would say the individual is now a woman. But traditional, non-Western frameworks for understanding masculine women or feminine men as third genders are often warped when viewed through a Western lens, which reinterprets them as trans women or trans men. That is a type of colonialism. Take, for example, Lorraine Hubbard, a 42-year-old from New Zealand, oh my goodness, say the word, who competed in men's weightlifting when younger with moderate success. In 2019, he won the gold medal at the Pacific Games competing in the women's division. The Samoan Prime Minister, who is the patron of the Samoan Fa'afafine, Association, remarked, quote, this Fa'afafine, or male, should never have been allowed by the Pacific Games Council president to lift with the women. It's not easy for the female athletes to train all year long to compete, and yet we allow these stupid things to happen. The reality is that gold medal belongs to Samoa. Unquote. As someone who is obviously not prejudiced against gender non-conforming individuals, he did not mince words for those who inject Western ideas of gender into traditional Samoan culture. Another popular example of a third gender is the Native American Two-Spirit. These men are originally labeled by the Europeans Baradarki, which is a pejorative term to describe a male prostitute. Because of its negative connotation, a new name needed to be created. According to anthropologist Serena Nandad, Two-Spirit is not an ancient Native American gender. Rather, it's a title coined in 1990 by urban Native American gays and lesbians. Okay, so why are we using it then? I feel like people are using colonialism too much and maybe in the wrong context. Yeah, I would say so. Like, do you remember that video of AOC talking about how cauliflower is racist, and how community gardens are usually ran by white people and so have more white foods because the white women often can stay home and have free time to do gardening, while she thinks there should be yucca in there. You know, maybe some Acapulco gold. You know, but not cauliflower. That white racist cauliflower. That's because it's white. Regardless of when the title was created and when, Native American gender variants were not considered to be individuals who changed their sex. Rather, they were individuals who often expressed an interest with the occupational activities of the other sex. For example, the Navajo Nali were effeminate males who often dressed and took on gender roles as women. The Mojave Alaiha were males who donned female attire, imitating feminine roles, and often took on a homosexual role within the culture, while the Mojave Hawame were females who associated with more masculine norms. Nanda explains, quote, among the Kaska, a family who had only daughters might select one to be like a man, as her hunting role could help provide the family with food. However, they were not considered to be the other sex. Such ideas, according to Nanda, quote, were not culturally acknowledged and to some extent were ridiculed, end quote. Scholars concur that these layers of diversity within Native American cultures reveal how the idea of third gender oversimplifies a complex subject. So it kind of sounds like there's just some men are more effeminate, some women are more masculine, and so, like in this case where a family had only daughters, maybe the most masculine among them would pick up some kind of like firstborn male roles and whatnot, and so made it dress accordingly and so on and so forth. They don't cease to be a woman. They're not some quasi man. They're just, once again, they're just doing the role, or perhaps even wearing clothing that would be appropriate to certain roles and such, like a man, or and so on and so forth. Not converted to a man, right? Yeah. It's not that they believe themselves to be women. So once again, okay, so let's say we have somebody in our culture who is a male who's more effeminate, who wants to wear dresses. This person doesn't think themselves to be a woman, just likes to express as a woman in culture like drag or something like that, right? Maybe that might be a better parallel, or in the case of this girl who's more masculine, she's more tomboyish and she wants to be a mechanic or something. I mean, okay, she's not a man. She may even still like men and so on and so forth. But what's important is to recognize that no matter what component are you? Are you the female or the male component of our sexually dimorphic species? And do you want a family? Do you want to have children? One has to ask these kinds of questions. Engaging in behaviors that involve your genitals outside of that context is intrinsically disordered. Even natural law shows us this, no matter how much you might like it or how attracted you might be to it. It's still disordered. It doesn't go there. All right. It has to be a really difficult thing for people to experience certain inclinations of a sort. and humanity has experienced a wide range of inclinations. And there's some that are in accordance with proper order, that's resigning within the context of nature and the teleos in nature, and other things just should and ought to be avoided altogether. I think that's one thing that separates us from the animals, is that we don't give in to our urges just because we have them. All right, there's a higher will. All right, we have an intellect that gives us a glimpse into the good and the true and the beautiful, the so-called transcendentals, all right, that bring us beyond merely being animals and giving into all our inclinations, you know. And I think that's one of the problems that we are running into, is what inclinations are healthy to explore and which ones should be suppressed, which ones we shouldn't give into. Like if somebody gets really enraged and angry and they start feeling murderous and they're having these ideations of how they're going to wound the other person, we would say, yeah, you need to you need to go get your head right. Take some space. Don't act on that. Calm down. And then revisit it when you have a cool head. That makes sense. And that's analogous for all kinds of things that would be disordered for us to give into in the moment. Because once again, we're not mere animals, right? We have an intellect, and we have a higher will. Moving from North to South America, one discovers a similar pattern in Brazilian culture. In this society, gender diversity, also understood to be rooted in one's sexual roles and behaviors. For example, the bicha, viado, and the transvesti are effeminate males whose male sexual partners are interestingly not considered homosexual because their role within the relationship is that of a masculine counterpart. Some who identify in this way make hormonal or minor surgical alterations to their bodies, but they believe it is impossible for a man to become a woman at the same time. Kind of a shame when people are mutilating their bodies. Serena Nanda notes that, quote, they believe that sex change operations do not produce women, but only castrated homosexuals. Transvestis modify their bodies not because they feel themselves to be a woman, but because they feel themselves to be like women in their behavior, appearance, and particularly in their relationships with men, unquote. A similar pattern is seen in Indonesia among the Waria and Kalabai, or Bai, who are also homosexual males who cross-dress and are often involved in prostitution. However, they do not identify as gay because they seek only heterosexual male partners who relate to them in a feminine manner. Surgical change is typically not sought by Waria, since changing one's sex is not seen as a possibility. Similarly, in Thailand, the term kathoe was originally reserved for individuals who had disorders of sexual development, but it now primarily refers to homosexual males who appropriate feminine attributes and are often involved in prostitution. It is actually quite sad. And it seems to be a lot of these men who find themselves to be more effeminate, and these cultures are often participants in prostitution and sexually immoral behaviors, very promiscuous with other males, for instance. Um, it's unfortunate. Um, Now, some have proposed that there's a gay gene, or there's nature and nurture reasons that probably that come into play, especially early experimentation and things of that. The context of socialization also plays a role here, and you have all these different factors coming together. Where I think with the proper guidance, one would find themselves not later in life engaging in bodily mutilation or illicit sexual behaviors or prostitution and so on and so forth. But I think often without proper moral guidance and without an understanding of themselves, like women who find themselves unlike some of the other women in school, for instance. They're not into the makeup and the dolls and stuff, and they'd rather wrestle around with the boys and stuff. And they need to understand that they're a woman too. That being a woman is not necessarily makeup and dolls, um, but women can do all kinds of stuff, right? So I think with proper guidance, these kids that are experiencing these things can live very fruitful and fulfilling lives without being seduced by transgender ideology, without engaging in same-sex relations and so on and so forth. That country that eliminated Down syndrome, who is to say they won't eliminate people just because they have some gay gene? I haven't. While I'm not convinced that there exists like some rogue gene somewhere or whatnot, once again, that kind of language just has to do with the nature aspect of things, and so many different things can go wrong with nature. We spent the first 6 parts of this really talking about all the different ways in which development can go wrong that can have an impact on how one comes to understand themselves, and especially in the case of like ambiguous genitalia and intersex conditions and so on and so forth. I would like to think that nobody should ever justify killing of children for any reason at all. I mean, I understand maybe the death penalty for an adult who every single time you let him out of prison, he's killing people and he's killing people in prison. I mean, at some point, it's just like he just keeps hurting people, and you know, you have to choose the best choice in all of that. But yeah, that would be really sad to see any culture that would set out to just kill people. See, people who struggle with same-sex attraction need compassion and guidance and grace and friendship. They don't need to be killed. They need Jesus, just like I need Jesus. We all have our crosses to bear. We all have our temptations. We all have those inclinations that come waving at us. And by wave, I mean like waving over us and trying to seduce us to give into those things. And that, you know, it can be very difficult, especially when somebody has already engaged in certain behaviors. The things that end up being associated with orgasms, for example, can bond oneself to objects and to ideas and to people, and I'm sure this happens with pornography, with images and videos and all of the sorts. So people who experiment when they're young, just reinforcing, the brain begins to think that, okay, I want that dopamine. This is how I got it before. So the brain's going to like an organ, is going to incentivize repeat behaviors where intense pleasure was experienced, even if those contexts are really bad. This often happens with rapists who repeat offend on people over and over and over again. As psychotic as that is, sometimes it's as simple as because he has developed that fetish. He's experienced the orgasm within that context, and his brain just wants to keep going at it. But once again, we're not mere animals, so we're not driven by mere natural causality. So the brain isn't always going to get what is most pleasurable to it, because we have a will that can stop it. When you want that third bowl of ice cream, your intellect can step in and you can say no. Where was I here? In other cultures, gender is intermingled with religious practices. In Indonesia, the Bisu are androgynous shamans, most often homosexual males who enter into possession trances in order to commune with spirits. Gender variant individuals also play an important role within Afro-Brazilian religions such as Candomblé, where individuals enter a possession trance whereby a spirit enters one's body. The priests of this religion are either females or effeminate males who must take the passive role in relation to the gods in order for the spirit to enter them. Many more examples of gender variant roles could be offered, such as the Mashoga of Kenya, the Maori Wakaweni, and the Hawaiian Mahu. However, a close examination of each shows what many of the above cultures reveal. If a person does not fit into binary gender roles within a society, it does not mean that he or she was born into the wrong body or needs to surgically modify it. In fact, when people surgically modify their bodies to quote-unquote become the other sex, they perpetuate a binary understanding of sex. In the words of one anthropologist, quote, transsexuals then, far from being an example of gender diversity, both reflected and reinforced the dominant Euro-American sex-gender ideology in which one had to choose to be either a man or a stereotypical woman, end quote. Although cultures will vary in terms of how they express the concepts of masculinity and femininity, Father Malachi Napier offers an important reminder when we're considering a universal definition of gender. He explains, and once again, I have no use of the word at all. So it's watching people give it some definition that's different. I don't know. It's just weird. I just have zero use for it. Gender refers to the cultural expressions of normative behaviors and characteristics of men and women. Why can't you just say, well, why do you have to use that word? Why can't you just say that there are cultural expressions of normative behavior and characteristics of men and women? And then we just talk about those expressions or those characteristics. Well, why is there why is that word being used? I guess I don't understand. And I don't even care if people have been using it since the 1950s. Now, I think that's when it started being used in this way. Prior to that, it was never really used among the social sciences to be defined as anything. So I guess I find myself not jumping on the train of modern liberal thought. I guess I always want to just go back and not think with the language and the concepts that they're proposing, because you can talk about cultural expression and norms of behaviors among men and women. That's fine. I just don't understand why this word, why not some other word? Reflects the narrative, the natural differences that exist between them, which we can do. We can talk about that. In fact, some of the chapters in this book go over some of the differences between male and female brains. The nuance needed is to have in mind the fact that every culture is marked by the disorder of sin, and so gender is neither an absolute manifestation of the essence of man and woman, nor is it some free-floating artifice without relationship to our ontological reality. And so I get what is being said in terms of when you start talking about like human nature, for instance, there are going to be things that are natural to human nature, but there's also things that will be morally disordered in our behaviors. Just because it is a behavior that our nature is capable of doing doesn't mean that it's necessarily natural to our nature to do that. It's not proper to our nature to do that. An example would be is going out in the woods and engaging in weird acts with monkeys and stuff and whatnot. Going out to the barn and doing some creepy things. It's not natural for human nature to engage in those kinds of relations with animals. Is it an act that our nature is capable of doing? Yes, but is it a disordered act that is therefore not proper to our nature? Yeah, it's not proper to our nature. Sorry, sometimes it's hard to bring examples to talking about what is and is not proper. So one more page, we're almost done. Anachronisms is the act of attributing something to a period of time to which it does not belong. It's when historians stare down the well of history and see their own reflection at the bottom. Oh, that's actually a really good example. For example, one of the immediate challenges that arises when claiming that other cultures have a third gender is the fact that this term is a Western concept that wasn't introduced until 1970. While it's true that many cultures have individuals who do not conform to rigid gender stereotypes, Towley and Morgan point out the problem in imposing Western concepts onto these cultures to understand them. Quote, members of North American transgender communities treat third gender natives of other cultures as part of their own imagined communities, invoking third gender. Examples, in an oversimplified way, are citing them out of context to overwrite Western social agendas, is an unwitting kind of neo-colonial or, in at least ethnocentric, appropriation that distorts the complexity and reality of other people's lives. We join an increasing number of anthropologists who caution against using caricatures of other cultures to advance locally situated arguments. Beware of recreating the worlds of other cultures to suit our own intentions. The danger inherent in this strategy is that the other becomes merely a rhetorical device for forwarding the identity of the self. End quote. Very, very fascinating thoughts of two individuals who identify as transgender. While gender theory professors accuse Europeans of eradicating gender diversity through colonizing indigenous people, developing nations today argue that the opposite is true. Western nations are now exporting the concept of gender theory into developing nations by tying foreign aid to the adoption of their ideologies. Pope Francis explains, quote, "A minister of education asked for a large loan to build schools for the poor. They gave it to her on the condition that in the schools there would be a book for the children of a certain grade level, in which gender theory was taught. This woman needed the money, but that was the condition. This is ideological colonization. Every people has its own culture, but when conditions are imposed by colonizing empires, they seek to make these people lose their own identity and create uniformity." That's something Pope Francis had said on this point. The idea of creating uniformity. Now, no, it's kind of interesting if we were to bring this into the realm of liturgy, for example. So, like, there's a lot of Eastern Rite liturgies in the Catholic Church, and there's the Roman Rite. It would be unthinkable for the Roman Rite to force itself upon all the other rites and Latinize them. And so, for instance, in Eastern rites, like in the Byzantine Rite, you may find that they stand most of the time. But you may actually go into a Byzantine Catholic church and find kneelers, for instance. And while it is more typical to see icons in the East, you may end up seeing statues as well in a Byzantine Catholic church. That is a Byzantine Catholic rite versus the Eastern Orthodox that are not in union with Rome. And so it was a common thing that had happened under what some of the East refer to as Unionites, that they had compromised themselves. They came into union with Rome, and there was this issue of the Latinizing of the Eastern liturgies. And so one thing that was encouraged by Vatican II is that these Eastern rites, for them to rediscover their own unique doctrinal, liturgical, and disciplinary distinctives, all right, to, in a sense, de-Latinize and to rediscover their own traditions prior to the Latinizing effects of the West. And so it's important for these different liturgies in the church to exist. They have grown out of different time and place and culture, and they are all beautiful in their own right. And so I think what he's talking about, trying to force uniformity. And in fact, ideological uniformity is often what the left wants. You know, they'd probably be perfectly happy with a global empire where just straight leftist woke ideology is just crammed down on everybody else. But at the same time, guess what? While I disagree with the substance, I find something about the form to be attractive. I do think everybody should be Catholic, and that we should live under a theocracy, and we should all live according to the Ten Commandments and have our consciences formed by Catholic moral teaching, and love each other and give alms, and and the such. So I mean, I kind of get, but of course there's one thing I like about the Catholic Church is that there's also like variety in liturgy and liturgical disciplines and doctrinal expressions and so on and so forth, that everybody would kind of find their home in all of it. So even then, there's not everybody has to be a Thomist. I'm a colonizer, right? Not everybody is a Thomist, or not everybody is a Molinist, and some people will become Franciscans, some people will become Dominicans, some people will be interested in canon law, some people will be interested in dogmatic theology. There's so much variety within the church. Well, I mean, in a sense, you can use that word colonizer, but it was Jesus's great commission to go and do all the world and preach the gospel. Teach them all all the remind them all the things that I have taught you, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So Christianity, has as its goal, the complete conversion of the world. Not by force, obviously, but that's the Great Commission, to preach the gospel to every creature. And so, if everybody is to be baptized and everybody is in relation to the church, and then there's catechesis, and then there's confirmation and the Eucharist, the sacrifice of the Mass. So Jesus' fault people are knocking on my door every Saturday morning. Do you got some Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses, or some people coming to knock on your door? 2 by 2. The thing is that in the gospel, Jesus chose 72. Now this is Jesus chose the 12 and then the 72 and whatnot, and there was significance in that reflected in Moses' time. There were I think it was 72 judges of like hundreds, 50s, 10s, and whatnot to help alleviate the responsibilities of him trying to handle everything on his own. But anyways, I think this is the parallel I'm thinking about. But they were said to go 2 by 2, and if you go into a city and they welcome you, that's great. You can stay at some house or whatnot and like commune with them, talk to them about Jesus, and then, but if they reject you, then you can, as you're leaving, knock the dust off your sandals, as a testimony against the city. So, yes, evangelization, talking to people about Jesus certainly was certainly important. But yeah, I suppose you could say it's Jesus' fault for being that we're asked to proselytize, so to speak, to go and spread the good news of the gospel, and Jesus loves you, and become one of us. One of us. All right, folks, it's 10:30 here. I enjoyed speaking with you, Consuls. Thanks for hanging out. I know we kind of jumped around a little bit in there. Now, I noticed that part 2 of the George Farmer and Ellie Beth Stuckey dialogue is now out on YouTube. So I'm going to need a good 3-hour block. So if I do that tomorrow, I'll have to get started around 8 my time. If I can't get started that early, then I might take the day off, or I might come down with another stream. I don't know. Look at this Catholic Guide to Understanding Gender again. But I'm going to need a good 3-hour block. I enjoyed the last one. It did last for a really long time. So I'm hoping that I won't be as wordy this time. But I noticed that the video that I did, this is really interesting, actually. I posted that yesterday, I think it was. It already has 128 views, which is kind of surprising because it's a 3-hour video. But I'm guessing that I think it's a bit too early for me to have some analytics, but it does look like people are jumping around in the video a little bit, but it does look like only about the average view duration is like 7 minutes. In fact, most people who click on it seem to be clicking off. But yeah, apparently only about 5% of the people who have clicked on this video have actually watched the whole thing, which is kind of interesting. Looks like some people jumped ahead, and that seems to be a common thing. But yeah, I enjoyed doing it. and I plan on doing it again. So, all right, thanks for watching, everybody. Have a wonderful evening. God bless, and we shall see you again.